It was a rainy evening when Eleanor first stumbled upon the old library. The town had been soaked in a gentle drizzle all day, and the streets gleamed under the soft glow of lanterns. The cobblestones were slick, the scent of wet earth lingering in the air. Eleanor had always been a wanderer, curious and quiet, and that day, her steps led her to a forgotten part of the town, a narrow, winding alley that twisted like an old story waiting to be told. At the end of the alley, she found a building cloaked in vines and moss. The structure seemed ancient, its windows fogged with age, its door barely visible beneath layers of dust and time. A faded sign above the entrance read, "The Archive of Forgotten Dreams." The name sent a shiver through her, not of fear but of intrigue. She hesitated, watching the rain fall in sheets, listening to the rhythmic tapping on the cobblestones. Then, almost as if something called her forward, she stepped closer, placing a hesitant hand on the door. The wood was rough beneath her fingers, but warm, as if it had been waiting for her. With a soft creak, the door swung open. A wave of cool, musty air greeted her, carrying with it the scent of old parchment and the faintest trace of something floral, like dried lavender pressed between pages. Eleanor took a step inside, and the world outside seemed to fade. The rain became a distant hum, the noise of the town dulled into a gentle silence. Inside, the library stretched endlessly. The ceiling arched high above, carved with patterns that shimmered in the dim light. Shelves rose like towers, filled with books of every shape and size, their spines worn, their titles in languages both familiar and strange. A faint glow seemed to pulse from the books themselves, as if they were alive, waiting to share their stories. Eleanor walked slowly, her footsteps muffled by a thick faded carpet. She ran her fingers along the spines of books, feeling the textures, the whispers of ages past. Some were smooth, others cracked and peeling. She paused at a section where the books had no titles, only symbols etched in silver and gold. She tilted her head, feeling a pull, as if these books wanted to be read. In the heart of the library, she noticed something peculiar. A spiral staircase leading downward into the earth. A soft golden glow flickered from below, and an inscription was carved into the wall. To dream is to remember. Eleanor felt her breath catch. The air seemed to shift, the library itself holding its breath, as if waiting for her to make a choice. She placed a hand on the railing, cool and smooth beneath her fingers, and began her descent. Each step creaked softly, and with each turn, the air grew warmer, the light brighter. The walls were lined with strange symbols, pulsing faintly, as if breathing. It felt like she was stepping into a place outside of time. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small chamber, lit by the soft glow of a single lantern hanging from the ceiling. In the center stood a table, and upon it, an open book. The pages shimmered, and as Eleanor drew closer, she saw that the words were not written in ink, but seemed to form from light itself, shifting and dancing across the page. She leaned in to read, and the words began to whisper in her mind. They spoke of forgotten stories, of dreams long lost, and of the power hidden within those who dared to listen. Eleanor felt her heart quicken. She reached out, fingers brushing the page, and in that instant, the room seemed to breathe. The air thickened, the light pulsed, and a warmth spread through her chest. Suddenly, the words lifted from the page, swirling around her like glowing ribbons of memory. They whispered secrets in her ear, stories of other worlds, of people she had never met, but somehow knew. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around her like a cocoon, and Eleanor felt herself being pulled into the story itself. The light brightened, the air shimmered, and then, silence. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the chamber. She stood in a vast, starlit field, the air crisp and cool, the sky a canvas of shimmering lights. The ground beneath her was soft, almost like velvet, and a path of glowing stones stretched before her. The library was gone. The rain was gone. Eleanor was in the story now, a part of the ancient library's secrets. And so, her journey began. Eleanor stood still for a long moment, her breath catching in the cool, starlit air. The velvet-like ground beneath her feet felt warm, as if the earth itself hummed with an ancient melody. All around her, the field seemed infinite, the sky stretching in every direction, scattered with constellations she had never seen. The glowing path of stones before her pulsed faintly, beckoning her onward. She hesitated. Was this real, a dream? The whispers of the book had spoken of forgotten stories and hidden worlds. Was she part of a story now? As she placed one foot forward, the ground beneath her shimmered, sending soft ripples outward like the surface of a still pond. Each step she took seemed to stir the air, awakening a quiet presence in the field. The further she walked, the more she noticed flowers that bloomed with a soft golden glow, grasses that whispered softly when the wind passed, and distant shapes flickering like candlelight in the dark. Soon, the path led her to a grand archway, carved from what looked like living wood. The bark glistened with a subtle silver sheen, and vines wrapped around the columns, their leaves pulsing gently. Inscribed above the arch in curling script were the words, "The Keeper awaits." Eleanor's heart quickened. She stepped through the arch, and the world seemed to shift. The starlit field dimmed, replaced by a circular room, vast and endless. Shelves spiraled upward, like trees in a forest, their branches bearing books that whispered and rustled, like leaves in a breeze. The floor was made of polished stone, smooth and cool beneath her feet. At the center of the room stood a figure tall, cloaked in deep midnight blue, their face hidden beneath a hood. In their hands, they held a long staff, topped with a glowing crystal that pulsed softly with golden light. The figure spoke, their voice a blend of echoes and gentle wind. "Welcome, reader. You have crossed the threshold of the dreaming archives. I am the keeper of the pages." Eleanor felt a shiver down her spine. She wanted to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The keeper seemed to sense her hesitation. "Fear not." They continued, their tone warm and slow, like the turning of a page. Many have walked this path before you, though few remember. You are here because the story has chosen you, the story." Eleanor managed to whisper. The keeper nodded, gesturing toward the shelves that rose like spiraling trees. "Every book in this library holds a world. Each page is a doorway, each story a path. But some books are lost, forgotten by time, hidden by dust, and their voices fade. You have been called to listen." Eleanor's mind swirled. The library had always seemed like a place of quiet, a refuge for forgotten stories, but she had never imagined it as something alive. The keeper extended a hand, their fingers long and elegant, their palm glowing faintly. A book appeared in their grasp, its cover worn, yet shimmering with a quiet light. On the spine, Eleanor saw her own name etched in silver. "This is your story," the keeper said softly. "It is unfinished. The threads of your tale are woven into many others, some joyful, some sorrowful, all waiting for you to remember." The book trembled in the keeper's hand, as if it longed to be opened. Eleanor hesitated, feeling the weight of possibility. "Will you read it?" the keeper asked gently. Eleanor took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the cover. The moment her skin met the book, a warmth surged through her, and a soft wind stirred the pages open. The words began to glow, forming into images, perhaps, or fragments of lives long past. She saw a glimpse of a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, her hair billowing in the wind, her face serene yet determined. A child running through a meadow of golden flowers, laughter sparkling like bells in the air. A great tree, its roots twisted deep into the earth, bearing fruit that shimmered with stardust. The images flickered and changed, and Eleanor felt herself drawn into them, as if she were part of the story itself. Suddenly, the keeper's voice whispered, closer now, almost inside her mind. "To read is to remember is to awaken." The words echoed through her, and the room seemed to pulse with energy. The shelves leaned closer, the books rustling in anticipation. Eleanor's heart pounded. She turned to the keeper, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens now?" The keeper tilted their head slightly, their voice gentle and timeless. "You journey onward. The next chapter is waiting." And as the words hung in the air, the room shifted again. The glowing path of stones reappeared beneath Eleanor's feet. Stretching forward into the unknown, with a deep breath, she took the first step forward. The journey had only just begun. The soft glow beneath Eleanor's feet lit the way as she continued along the stone path. The memory of the keeper's words still echoed in her mind. The next chapter is waiting. She walked in silence, letting the hum of the earth and the soft rustle of invisible leaves guide her thoughts. As the path twisted gently, the darkness around her began to shift. The stars above dimmed slightly, replaced by a gentle golden light that filtered through unseen leaves. A warm, floral fragrance wrapped around her like a blanket: lavender, honeysuckle, and something older, something ancient. It reminded her of summers in her grandmother's garden. Long forgotten, but suddenly vivid again. Then she saw it. Before her lay a vast garden, unlike anything she had ever seen in the waking world. Trees with silver trunks and leaves of every shade, from emerald to deep indigo, swayed gently, though there was no wind. Blossoms bloomed with quiet sparkles of light, releasing whispers instead of scents. The air shimmered faintly, like heat rising off a summer road, but cooler, gentler, as if the garden itself breathed in rhythm with her. In the center of it all was a grand fountain made of clear crystal, its waters swirling not with liquid, but with light and fragments of color. Each droplet that rose and fell sparkled with fleeting images, a child's laughter, a memory of rain on rooftops, the feeling of a loved one's hug. Eleanor stood at the edge of the garden, awestruck. It wasn't just beautiful, it felt familiar, not in the way of memory, but in the way dreams sometimes feel like home. She stepped onto the soft moss lining the path, and it gave slightly beneath her feet, releasing a soft sigh. The flowers nearest to her turned their glowing faces toward her as if in greeting. A small creature appeared from behind a tall fern, something between a rabbit and a cloud, with tiny luminous eyes and fur that shimmered like moonlight on water. It tilted its head at her, then bounded ahead, pausing every few steps, as if urging her to follow. She did, as Eleanor followed the creature deeper into the garden. She noticed how every corner held a scene, a moment, a story playing softly in the air. To her left, a vine curled up a stone pillar, blooming into soft pink roses that hummed a lullaby, the same her mother used to sing at bedtime. To her right, a tree opened like a book, revealing within its hollow trunk a swirling image of a picnic she once had as a child, a moment long buried under years of growing up. "These are dreams," she whispered, almost afraid to disturb them. A voice beside her answered, gentle and aged, like wind through parchment. "No, dear reader. These are remembered dreams." Eleanor turned and found a woman standing nearby. She was older, wrapped in robes of woven leaves and golden thread. Her hair flowed like silver rivers over her shoulders, and her eyes were the color of dawn mist. "I am Lysara," she said, bowing her head slightly. "Caretaker of the garden." Eleanor bowed awkwardly in return. I didn't know there were others here." Lysara smiled, a smile full of patience. "Few walk these paths, but those who do often forget they were never alone." She beckoned Eleanor to sit with her on a stone bench beneath a glowing fruit tree. The small creature, the dreamling, Eleanor now thought of it, curled at her feet. Lysara plucked a glowing pear from the tree and handed it to Eleanor. "Eat and remember." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before taking a bite. The fruit melted in her mouth, warm and cool, all at once, and instantly her mind was flooded with memories, not just her own, but distant echoes of others. A ballerina dancing under starlight, a fisherman whispering a lullaby to the sea, a child building castles in clouds. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of it all. Lysara watched her kindly. "This garden blooms from the dreams we forget. The happy ones, the half-formed ones, even the strange, fleeting ones." All dreams have weight, and all dreams are remembered here. Eleanor looked around again, the garden more alive now than ever before. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because," Lysara said, "to understand the story, you must remember the dreams you once let go. The ones that shaped you, the ones that led you here." Eleanor thought of the night she found the ancient book in the library, how it called to her, how she felt something stir deep within her chest. Maybe that moment had not been chance at all. "Is this part of the book?" she asked softly. Lysara nodded. "Every dream, every memory, every step you take. All of it writes the story, and you, Eleanor, are not just the reader. You are becoming the author." Eleanor felt the weight of that truth settle over her like a warm shawl. The idea was daunting, but also freeing. Lysara stood and offered her hand. "Come, there is more to see before you return to the path." They walked together through the dream-blossomed groves, past floating ponds filled with mirrored stars, through archways made of moonbeams and winding staircases carved from lullabies. Eleanor saw the dreams of strangers and of herself, pieces of her life she had forgotten, now blooming quietly in this sacred place. Eventually, they came to a door woven from vines and starlight. It pulsed gently, waiting. "Beyond here lies the next part of your story," Lysara said. "But remember what you've seen. Dreams do not die, they wait. And sometimes, they bloom when you need them most." Eleanor stepped forward, touching the door. It uncurled, like a flower opening to dawn, and a soft breeze flowed through, carrying scents of ink, parchment, and something deeper possibility. She turned once to Lysara. "Will I see you again?" Lysara's eyes twinkled. "In every forgotten dream, I will be there." And with that, Eleanor stepped through the doorway, the world shifting once more. The garden faded, the stars reappeared, and ahead of her, the path glowed faintly once again. The story moved forward. The doorway closed gently behind Eleanor, its vines and starlight folding back into the earth like a sigh. She found herself standing on a quiet path once again, this one narrower, lined on both sides with tall trees, whose leaves shimmered in shades of deep blue and silver. The air felt cooler now, filled with the soft rustle of leaves whispering in the gentle breeze. Eleanor took a deep breath. The memory of the Garden of Dreams lingered, like a faint perfume clinging to her senses. It was as if the echoes of remembered dreams still hummed within her chest, a quiet warmth guiding her forward. The path ahead seemed endless, stretching into a soft fog that danced with faint lights, like fireflies in the distance. With each step, the sound of her footsteps mingled with the whispers in the leaves, soft, indistinct voices, as though the trees themselves were telling secrets. She paused, listening closely. At first, the words were too quiet to understand, just a hush of sound, like distant rain. But as she closed her eyes and focused, the whispers began to shape into words, drifting in the air like threads of a forgotten melody. "Remember, what lies beneath the surface. The stories untold, Eleanor shivered slightly, a tingle of curiosity and wonder running down her spine. She reached out and touched one of the glowing leaves. It felt warm against her fingertips, and as she brushed it, a soft image shimmered in her mind: an old oak tree with a hollow trunk. A child's laughter echoing within. She blinked, the vision fading like mist. It was then that she noticed something odd. The trees along the path were not quite still. Their branches leaned gently toward her, as if bowing in greeting. Some leaves seemed to lift slightly, catching the light, while others drifted down softly. Settling onto the path ahead, she realized that the leaves were not just whispering, they were guiding her. Eleanor followed the trail of fallen leaves, watching how they formed patterns on the ground: spirals, swirls, lines that curved like ancient runes. The air seemed thicker here, full of magic, and she felt it in her very breath. She reached a clearing where the trees parted, revealing a wide circle of grass under a pale silvery moon. In the center stood a single ancient tree, its trunk gnarled and wide, its branches twisting upward like arms reaching for the stars. The tree's bark shimmered faintly, almost like metal, and as Eleanor stepped closer, she noticed that the bark was covered in intricate carvings, symbols, pictures, words in languages she couldn't recognize. She ran her fingers lightly over the surface, and a soft pulse of energy flowed through her heartbeat. Slow and steady, like the earth itself was breathing. A voice, soft female, and melodic rose from within the tree. "You have come far, seeker of stories. What do you wish to know?" Eleanor swallowed, her voice trembling as she replied, I want to understand. Why am I here? What is this place?" The voice responded, each word like a ripple in a calm pond. "You are on the path of remembering, where the forgotten stories rest. Each step you take writes a chapter in the book of whispers. But the story is not yet complete. You must choose: will you follow the whispers, or turn back?" Eleanor felt the weight of the question settle in her heart. She thought of the Garden of Dreams, of the keeper's gentle smile, of the countless stories waiting to be found. "I will follow the whispers," she said softly, her voice firm. The tree's branches swayed gently, a soft rustle of approval. A small opening appeared in the trunk, revealing a glowing crystal shard, small, delicate, and pulsing with light. "Take this," the voice said. "It is a key, and a promise. Use it when the time comes." Eleanor reached out, her fingers closing around the crystal. The moment she touched it, a warmth spread through her palm, and the whispers in the leaves grew louder, no longer just words, but fragments of stories, names, and places waiting to be explored. She tucked the crystal into her pocket, her heart racing with quiet excitement. The path ahead seemed clearer now, the fog lifting just enough to reveal another gentle curve in the road. The whispering leaves swayed softly in the moonlight, as if guiding her forward. With a deep breath, Eleanor stepped back onto the path, ready to discover what lay ahead. And so, the story continued. The night deepened as Eleanor continued her journey along the moonlit path, the crystal warm in her pocket, a quiet reminder of the whispers she had promised to follow. The wind carried soft murmurs, a blend of rustling leaves and faint, echoing voices, fragments of forgotten stories that seemed to swirl around her. Guiding her steps ahead, the trees parted once more, revealing a small clearing bathed in soft, silver light. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient well, its stones worn smooth by time. Moss and small white flowers growing in the cracks. A gentle glow emanated from the well's depths, as if it held something more than just water, something ancient. Something waiting. Eleanor approached cautiously, her footsteps silent on the grass. As she leaned over the edge, she could see the water glistening far below, the surface rippling in slow, hypnotic circles. The whispers grew stronger here, wrapping around her like a soft shawl, each voice faint and distant, yet clear enough to feel in her bones. The well of forgotten names. The wind seemed to say, a place where memories lost are stored, where names no longer spoken rest, waiting to be remembered. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She wondered what names had been forgotten here. What stories had been buried in these waters, waiting for someone to listen. A soft voice spoke from the shadows, gentle and melodic, like a lullaby. Few come here, seeker. Fewer still are brave enough to listen. Startled, Eleanor turned. From the darkness, a figure stepped forward, an elderly woman, draped in layers of moss-green robes. Her hair, a tangle of silver, streaked with moonlight. Her eyes sparkled like stars, and her skin seemed etched with the lines of countless years. I am the keeper of the well, the woman said, her voice warm, yet powerful. You seek stories, and here they are, waiting for you. Eleanor nodded, feeling her heart quicken. How do I hear them? She asked softly. The keeper smiled, her gaze both kind and knowing. You must offer something in return. The well remembers only what is given, a name, a memory, a secret. What will you offer, seeker of whispers? Eleanor hesitated, the weight of the question settling deep within her. She thought of the dreams she had once had, the stories she had left behind, moments forgotten in the rush of life. Then, with a trembling voice, she whispered, I will give a memory, a piece of my past. The keeper nodded slowly, as if this was the answer she had been waiting for. Then speak, and the well shall listen. Eleanor closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She thought of a warm summer afternoon, from her childhood, running through the fields behind her grandmother's house, the scent of lavender thick in the air, her laughter ringing like a bell. She spoke the memory aloud, letting it flow into the air, letting it drift toward the well. The moment the words left her lips, the glow in the well intensified. The water shimmered, and a single name rose from the depths, spoken in a soft, echoing voice, Mira. Eleanor's eyes widened. The name felt familiar, as if it had been a part of her once an old friend, a forgotten piece of her soul. The keeper smiled, a twinkle in her gaze. You have given, and you have received. Remember this name. It is yours now to carry. Eleanor nodded slowly, the name Myra whispering in her mind, gentle and warm. The keeper gestured toward the path beyond the well, where the trees parted once more. Your journey continues, seeker. There are more stories to find, and more to give. With gratitude, Eleanor bowed her head and stepped forward once more, her heart filled with a quiet wonder. The path ahead shimmered faintly, and she felt the weight of her story growing, a tapestry woven from whispers, memories, and names. Once lost, but now found. And so, her journey continued, the well of forgotten names, a soft, glowing beacon behind her. In the heart of winter, when the cold seeped through the stones of the cottages, and the wind howled like a hungry beast outside, medieval peasants faced their toughest challenge, surviving the long, dark nights. The days were short, the sun barely a visitor in the sky, and the nights stretched endlessly, wrapping the land in a cold, heavy silence. Inside the humble homes of the villagers, every flicker of warmth was precious. A single fireplace, built from rough stones and soot stained from years of use, served as the heart of the home. Around this hearth, families huddled together, layered in every scrap of fabric they owned. Old cloaks, tattered blankets, and hand-stitched woolen tunics became shields against the icy grip of the winter. Food was scarce in these months. The granaries, which once overflowed with the harvest of summer and autumn, now held only remnants. Each meal was a careful calculation. A bit of barley gruel for the children, a crust of bread for the elders, a sliver of dried meat, if they were lucky. The luxury of a hearty stew was rare, reserved for feast days or when a neighbor shared from their dwindling stores. But peasants were resourceful. They dried herbs in the warmer months, tucking them away to add flavor and, they hoped, medicinal value to the bland dishes of winter. They knew which roots could be dug from the frozen earth, which bark could be brewed into a bitter but life-sustaining tea. The nights were a test of endurance, not just against the cold, but against fear. Wolves roamed closer in winter, their howls sometimes breaking the quiet of the night, a reminder that survival was a daily battle. Families whispered stories in the dim glow of the fire, tales of brave ancestors, of the return of spring, of the warmth that would one day come again. These stories, though simple, were a form of hope, a promise that the darkness would not last forever. Sometimes, when the wind was still, they could hear the bells from the manor church, a distant, comforting sound that reminded them they were part of a larger world. But often the only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the occasional creak of wooden beams, and the soft breathing of those huddled close, seeking warmth from one another. It was in these quiet, cold hours that the bonds of family and community grew strongest. A neighbor might lend a bit of firewood, or a mother might offer a scrap of wool to a child who shivered too much. These small acts of kindness wove a fabric of resilience that held the village together. The medieval peasants. Life was not easy. but it was marked by a quiet courage, a willingness to endure the harshest of seasons with patience and hope. And as the long nights wore on, they clung to the belief that in time, the world would warm again, the days would grow longer, and the fields would bloom with new life. The coldest nights were endured not just by huddling near the fire, but by holding on to each other, and by holding on to the dream of spring. Asterisk, the snow had settled like a soft blanket over the village, covering the rooftops, the winding paths, and the bare branches of trees. Each morning, the peasants awoke to a world hushed and still, as if the cold had pressed pause on the universe. And yet, life, however quiet, continued inside the modest homes, where smoke curled from chimneys and frosted windows framed the sleepy faces of children. Warmth was a scarce and treasured gift. Every log in the fire was rationed with care, each ember coaxed and tended as if it were the heart of the home itself. Peasant families often gathered around the small hearth, sitting close together, their breaths rising in little clouds as they spoke in whispers, or simply sat in the comfort of one another's presence. In these long winters, peasants found small ways to keep hope alive. Some would mend tools by the firelight, their rough hands working carefully to repair a cracked handle or sharpen a worn blade. Others would mend clothing, patching holes in tunics, or restitching the frayed edges of blankets, each movement slow and precise, a rhythm passed down through generations. The children, too, had their quiet joys. They would carve small toys from leftover bits of wood, tiny animals, or spinning tops, or little figures that could act out stories in the flickering firelight. Laughter was rare but precious in these times, a spark of life that warmed the soul, even when the body remained cold at night. When the world outside seemed swallowed in darkness, the peasants would tell stories. These were not grand tales of kings and battles, but simple fables about the fox that outwitted the hunter, or the old woman who spun gold from straw, or the brave child who found their way home in a storm. These stories carried the wisdom of survival, patience, cleverness, and the unshakable belief that better days would come. The winter sky, when visible, was a dark, endless tapestry, studded with stars that seemed impossibly far away. Many a peasant would look up and wonder at the mysteries above, tracing the constellations their elders had taught them. Orion with his belt, the Big Dipper pointing the way to the North Star. These simple acts of stargazing, done while wrapped in a thin cloak against the cold, gave them a sense of place in the vast, unknowable world. Dreams were a comfort too. A peasant might drift to sleep with visions of a warm spring, afternoon fields green and bursting with wheat, the sound of bees buzzing lazily through the blossoms, and the scent of fresh earth rising after a gentle rain. These dreams were distant, but they were not forgotten. Each day endured was a step closer to the warmth they longed for. There was an old saying among the villagers: "Winter is long, but it bends to the will of time." They believed that even the harshest frost would one day melt. The darkest night would end in dawn, and the hardest life could still hold moments of peace and beauty. In the end, it was this quiet hope that carried them through. The peasants knew no grand comforts or luxuries, but they knew how to endure. And as the nights passed, they held on to that knowledge like a lantern in the dark. A small flame of resilience that would see them through the long, cold months ahead. The snow had grown heavier now. Each morning, the doors of peasant huts groaned against the weight pressing against them. Chimneys coughed dark smoke into the pale skies, and beneath the cold silence, life pulsed on in its quiet rhythm. Inside the cottages, the air was filled with the earthy scent of burning logs. Dry herbs hung to ward off illness, and the musky warmth of bodies gathered close together. The fire crackled like an old storyteller, its voice low and steady, speaking in sparks and sighs. Around this flickering hearth, families huddled on straw mats and wooden stools. Wrapped in wool cloaks, cloaks that smelled of smoke and sheeps. Lanolin here. Stories were told not for entertainment, but survival. They gave structure to long hours and distraction from the biting cold. An old grandfather with a voice like worn leather would begin. There was once a forest where the wolves whispered to the trees. No one interrupted. The children stared into the flames, imagining each tree, each whisper. Even the adults leaned in, their hands stilling over half-mended tunics or cold, dry loaves of bread. These tales served more than a purpose of fantasy. They encoded memory, how to find edible roots beneath the snow, how to read winds howl for signs of storm or thaw. Through the stories, the peasants remembered. Outside, the world remained frozen. The livestock were kept in shelters, their bodies creating pockets of warmth for each other. Goats leaned into sheep, chickens burrowed into hay, and the cow's breath steamed the air. In the barns, children did small chores, their hands chapped and red, but smiling because they were trusted with real work. The animals were part of the family, not just for food, but for companionship, for meaning. In the kitchen corners of homes, pots simmered. Whatever the land had given in autumn, dried beans, barley, salted turnips, was combined into slow stews that took all day to soften. There was never enough, but it was made to stretch, seasoned with onions, garlic, and hope. Neighbors, too, were lifelines. Winter was not a time for isolation. A widow might receive a surprise knock on her door and find a small parcel of firewood or a crust of bread left by her threshold. No thanks expected. No names exchanged. Just silent warmth. In this season, Time behaved differently. The sun hung low and moved slowly. The days passed with the rhythm of tasks: waking, feeding, chopping, sewing, warming, waiting, sleeping. Evenings bled into nights, so seamlessly that sometimes no one noticed where one ended and the other began. But something happened in the shared hush of those nights. Bonds grew deeper. The father, who in summer was distant with labor, now had time to braid his daughter's hair by candlelight. The mother, usually rushed and weary, sang lullabies she remembered from her own childhood. Friends who rarely spoke, in the rush of harvest, now traded whispered thoughts over mended mittens and cracked mugs of nettle tea. And so, the peasants endured, not just with hard work and skill, but with closeness, with stories, with a fire that was not only for heat, but for light, for memory, for laughter that rose gently, like embers. And always, the hope quiet and constant that spring would come. Even now, as the snow lay like a heavy sigh over the thatched roofs, and the stars blinked dimly through the frost-laced sky, the people waited not in fear, but in knowing. This was not their first winter, and it would not be their last. As winter reached its deepest silence, when the wind no longer howled, but murmured gently across the frozen fields, a quiet shift came upon the village. It was the time for the midwinter gathering, a moment not of celebration, but of communion, of simple human togetherness in the heart of the coldest season. Even the trees seemed to understand. Their bare arms reached to the pale sky, motionless, as if listening. The snow lay thick upon the earth, unbroken, except for narrow paths, beaten down by the trudging of boots, and the wooden sleds, drawn by calloused hands. The entire village moved. Slowly, cautiously yet purposefully toward the old barn at the village's edge. The barn was nothing grand. Its roof sagged slightly, patched over the years with straw and tar. Its walls creaked with each gust of wind, but inside it was warm. Not just because of the fire that smoldered safely in the stone hearth at the far end, but because it held people faces that had shared many winters. Voices that knew when to speak and when to simply be present. Each family brought something, however small: a pouch of dried apples, a jug of thin cider, a wedge of hard-aged cheese, a carved spoon, a song, a story. The gathering was not about plenty, it was about pooling what little each had, so no one felt alone. Children giggled. In a corner, where a blanket had been strung between beams, creating a makeshift fort, they played quietly with small wooden animals and wax candles shaped like stars. Their laughter was gentle and slow, as if the cold had softened even their mischief. Old women in thick shawls sat near the hearth, whispering in soft voices about births and weather signs, about herbs that could soothe a cough or mend a fever. Their hands were never still knitting, spinning, stitching, and in their eyes shone the kind of wisdom that only comes when you've watched the snow fall across more decades than you care to count. The men, broad-shouldered and slow-moving, took turns adding logs to the fire, nodding respectfully as each new group arrived. They spoke little, but their presence was grounding. Their boots left melted patches in the hay-covered floor, and their breath steamed with each quiet word. When all had gathered and silence settled over the room like a blanket, the village elder stood bent-backed, white-bearded, wrapped in furs. He carried no staff, no symbol of office. Just a small book with cracked leather binding and pages that whispered when turned. He opened the book and began to read. But these were not laws or sermons. These were winter stories once passed, from father to son, mother to daughter, through countless seasons. Tales of clever foxes, lost travelers, invisible spirits of frost, and brave children who tricked the snow itself. The rhythm of his voice, slow and gravelly, lulled even the adults into a trance. The barn's rafters held the sound like a memory. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft as flour, erasing even the sharpest edges of the world. When he finished, he closed the book without a word. No applause, no response, just the quiet crackle of the fire and the shared breath of those who had come to listen. Then came the songs, soft old songs. Songs whose meanings had faded, but whose melodies remained like fingerprints on the heart. One voice would start, uncertainly. Another would join, then more. The harmony was imperfect, human, beautiful. Somewhere in the back, a young girl fell asleep against her mother's lap, the wool of her sleeve damp with breath. A baby stirred in its sling, then settled again. The barn, for all its rough wood and creaking beams, felt like a cradle. Eventually, the fire died down to a low glow. One by one, families stood, nodded their goodbyes, and stepped back into the snowy dark. No torches, just moonlight. Just the crunch of footsteps leading home, and so, the midwinter gathering came to an end. Not with fanfare, but with peace. It had done its work. Spirits were lifted, hearts were warmed, and the village, together, had remembered something quiet and true, that no one survives winter alone. And when the door of the last hut closed for the night, the snow fell just a little softer, and the wind paused as if listening to the final notes of a lullaby still floating through the trees. In the heart of the coldest stretch of winter, when nights lingered long and the sun was just a pale guest on the edge of the sky, life for medieval peasants shrank down to the space between one candle and one hearth. By now, every home had drawn inwards, the small huts that lined the edge of the field stone at the bottom. Wattle and daub above were no longer places of movement and work. They became caves of survival. Every crack had been stuffed with cloth, moss, or straw. The doorways were thick with blankets or hide, nailed down to keep the wind at bay. Smoke curled lazily from low chimneys, trailing into the pale grey sky. Inside, the world had grown smaller. Most peasant families shared a single room. In that space, one fire burned all day and night, not roaring, but steady. Fed carefully with the dried sticks gathered in summer and stored like treasure. A single hearthstone, blackened by time, stood as the quiet heart of it all. Near the fire, a candle stood upright in a clay holder. It was made of tallow animal fat, its smell faintly sour, but familiar. This candle was not lit casually. Lighting it was an act of purpose. It meant someone needed to see clearly. And seeing was costly in a world where light came only from flame. Sometimes it was the mother who lit it. Her fingers red from cold, squinting to mend a torn sleeve or to mix herbs for a child's cough. Sometimes it was the eldest daughter, slowly writing letters on a wax tablet, guided by the flickering gold. And sometimes really it was lit for no reason at all. Just so someone could look at the faces around them and feel less alone. The flicker of that candle on stone walls painted shadows that danced slowly, figures in a quiet play. The children watched them. They made stories from them. They named the shadows and gave them voices. In a world without toys or books, this was imagination's theater. Around the hearth, blankets and cloaks were heaped. Peasants slept together, father, mother, children, sometimes a grandparent, under the same layer of warmth. Modesty was a luxury. Survival required closeness. The warmth of a body was more dependable than fire. Their meals were simple: porridge, thick and steaming, sometimes with a pinch of dried root or a crumble of cheese. Occasionally, there was pottage vegetables, stewed all day in a single iron pot, hanging above the fire. The smell filled the room, blending with the earthy scent of wool, smoke, and damp wood. There were no clocks to mark time. Days were known by the feel of the light, the creak of the roof, the shifting of the fire's shadows. A rooster's call in the distance meant little in a season where even the birds stayed silent. At night, when the fire dimmed and the candle was pinched out, the darkness returned like a slow tide. It filled the room, patient and complete. Yet, it was not frightening. It was the old, familiar dark, thick still, and known. Families lay close, listening not to music or stories, but to breath. The breath of a child, the breath of the wind, the steady rhythm of life continuing, one slow hour at a time. Sometimes, they prayed, not with great ceremony, but quietly murmured, Thanks for warmth, for food, for each other, for not being alone in this long winter. The prayers were not always hopeful, but they were steady. And steadiness, in the heart of winter, was sacred. The candle sat cold on its holder, its wick curled black. Tomorrow it might be lit again. Or not. It would wait, and the hearth, the true soul of the home, glowed faintly with embers. It was always there, always waiting. A promise in the dark, asterisk, by the time the 11th week of true winter settled in. Time itself felt like it had slowed. The days were short, but they felt long, and the nights stretched into eternity, like wide, silent oceans of cold. For medieval peasants, this was the deep heart of the season. The part where even hope grew still, like the frozen rivers and stiffened fields beyond their doors. There was a silence that came with this part of winter. It wasn't just the absence of birdsong or footsteps in the village lanes. It was a thick, soft silence, like a blanket of snow tucked over the world. No carts rumbled down the muddy paths. No laughter echoed from the alehouse. Even the animals were quieter. Hens sat huddled. Cows exhaled slow clouds of steam. And the old barn cat curled into a ball and barely stirred. Inside the homes, that silence became a companion. People spoke less. There were no new stories to tell. No travelers to bring news. Even the gossip had frozen like the pond beyond the orchard. Families spoke in murmurs, or not at all. Children whispered. Adults nodded. The crackle of the fire filled in the spaces, as did the occasional creak of the rafters, or the gentle rustle of someone shifting beneath a blanket. In such quiet, even the smallest sounds became important. A spoon against a wooden bowl, the snap of a twig in the hearth, the gentle breathing of the baby asleep by the fire. These sounds were not interruptions, they were reassurance. They meant someone was still here. Someone was still warm. Someone was still alive. During these weeks, dreams took on special meaning. Sleep was long and deep. The cold made bodies heavy, still, and slow. People would speak of what they dreamed, visions of green fields, warm bread, sun on the water. No one knew if the dreams were real memories, or simply the mind's way of surviving the cold. In the darkness, dreams became little windows of warmth. Somewhere, buried beneath the stillness, seeds slept too. Out in the hard ground, invisible to the eye, the tiniest signs of spring waited in silence. The peasants didn't talk about spring yet. It felt too far away, too unreal. But deep in their bones, they hoped. They always hoped. Hope was a quiet thing, like a coal that glows, but doesn't flame. So they carried on, 1 hour at a time, they made small repairs to tools with whatever scraps were left. They turned broken pots into patched containers. They rewove baskets. They spun wool, slowly, steadily, from the thread of last summer's sheep. The women's hands moved even in the cold, their fingers stiff but practiced. The men mended handles and sharpened blades. Even though there was little to cut but silence, children found ways to pass the time, stacking pebbles, whispering stories, tracing frost on the windows with warm breath. They counted the knots in the ceiling beams or named the shapes in the smoke. There was something timeless about it all. No news came, no messengers knocked. The church bell was muffled under snow. It didn't matter what day it was. What mattered was warmth, bread, a place to lie, a hand to hold if the night became too long. And when the wind howled low and hollow, curling around the houses like a ghost, they simply pulled the blankets higher, pressed close, and waited for morning. Not much changed, but each morning that did come, no matter how grey, felt like a gift. And that was enough. By the 12th stretch of snow-kissed nights, even the shadows in the peasants' homes began to feel like familiar friends. These weren't ominous shadows, they were quiet shapes. The kind that shifted slowly across wooden walls as the firelight flickered low. The tall one cast by the broom leaned gently by the door. The soft oval from the hanging herbs above the hearth. The ripple of shadow from the family's wool blanket, draped carefully between two pegs to dry. For those who lived through medieval winters, such shapes became part of the room's soul. As light faded and candles burned down, these silhouettes settled into stillness, and the people grew used to their quiet company. The hearth, of course, remained the center of everything. It wasn't just for warmth, though that was sacred in winter. It was a companion, a storyteller, and a guardian of life. The low hum of burning wood, the occasional hiss of sap, the way flames danced lazily against blackened stones, it all became a kind of music. Flicker, crackle, glow, silence. Evenings around the hearth were not noisy. The tales told were old ones, often whispered rather than recited. Stories of saints and serpents, of winters colder than this one, though everyone doubted that could be possible. Grandmothers spoke of dreams they'd once had, or signs they'd read in the smoke, or the way the chickens had laid their eggs, just so, before the snow came early one year. No one argued. No one challenged. These weren't stories for debate. They were blankets of words, soft and worn. laid gently across the heart. Some peasants kept small charms near the hearth, little tokens carved from bone or etched in old symbols. They weren't magical, not really, but they were part of the rhythm, the comfort, passed down through generations. They lived in the cracks between faith and superstition, between memory and forgetting. And they watched, quietly, as the shadows danced. Even the animals in the house, if there were any, grew attuned to the hush of hearth life. A dog might lift its head slowly when someone shifted in their sleep, then lower it again with a sigh. A chicken in its crate might cluck once, then fall silent. The old cat would stretch toward the fire's warmth, yawn, and nestle in again. These sounds became the rhythm of winter. Sometimes, someone would hum. Not a song, just a line or two of an old tune, meant for no one in particular. A soft rise and fall of sound, like a lullaby spoken more to the shadows than to the people. And then the room would slip back into its dreamy silence. There were no clocks. Time was told by the fire's rise and fall, by the feel of the cold on one's skin, or the length of one's shadow in candlelight. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Soft, steady, soundless. The world beyond the walls had grown distant. It was another place, icy fields, frozen wells, gates that stuck from frost. But within the home, the world had shrunk into something manageable. A circle of warmth, a ring of flickering light, and the slow, steady breathing of those who endured. Endurance itself was a quiet art. It meant knowing when not to speak, when to simply watch the fire, when to fold one's hands and wait, when to add a small log. Not because it was cold, but because the fire deserved company to dot in such moments. Even sadness had a place. A quiet, gentle kind of sadness that settled like dust on the old stones. Not heavy, not sharp. Just there. And with it came something else, peace. Because when you've lived long enough with shadows on the wall, with silence as your closest companion, and with a fire that needs tending more than talk, you learn that peace is not the absence of cold. It's the presence of warmth, however small. And so, another night slipped by. One more deep breath into the soft, slow rhythm of winter. And tomorrow, they would rise again, quietly, gently. Together, in the thick of winter. When the sky seemed to forget the color blue, and the trees stood still, as statues, even the smallest. Light became precious, and so it was that the humble lantern that's flocked glowing creaky wooden frame with its flickering flame became a symbol of quiet, strength in the lives of medieval peasants. It wasn't fancy. A lantern in the peasant's cottage was made from what was available. Maybe a bit of tin hammered thin, or a frame of willow twigs wrapped in old cloth dipped in animal fat. The glass, if they had any at all, was rippled and thick. Most times, though it was horn-scraped thin, or even nothing at all, just a screen to keep the wind from blowing the candle out. Yet it glowed. That faint light might only reach a few steps ahead in the darkness. But in a world without electric bulbs or city lamps, those few steps meant safety, meant comfort, meant knowing where your next footfall would land when all else was frozen and unknown. Peasants used their lanterns with care. Light was a resource, not something to be wasted. Oil was precious. Wax was made by hand, and so lanterns were lit only when needed. But when they were, the whole mood of the room changed. Children would lean close to the glow, tracing shapes in the air with their fingers. Mothers would sew quietly by the light, their needles glinting as they moved through thick wool or rough linen. Old men, wrapped in blankets, would hum a tune or whisper a story. The lantern light warming their cheeks. Outside, the snow might fall heavier. The wind might call through the thatch, but inside the lantern's glow, there was safety, warmth, stillness at night. The lantern often guided someone out to check on the animals. Chickens needed closing in. Goats needed a glance. The fire in the outbuilding needed a small stoking. A child might go along, holding on to their father's coat, eyes wide in the dark. The light swayed as they walked forward, then back. Long shadows across snowdrifts and narrow paths. They didn't talk much. There wasn't a need to. The world was quiet, and in that quiet, the crunch of boots in snow, the soft squeak of hinges on a wooden door, the low murmur of an animal greeting, felt like a language of its own. When the chores were done, the lantern would guide them back through the frost-kissed path, back into the cottage, where the door creaked shut and the warmth folded over them like a blanket. And someone, mother, grandmother, elder sibling would say softly, "You're just in time." Because The evening meal had been warmed. The herbs in the stew had steeped. The coals in the hearth had settled into a gentle red, and the floor had been swept of straw. The lantern would be placed carefully back on the table, and its light would shine across wooden bowls. Hands curled around mugs of warm broth, and eyes slowly growing heavy. It wasn't just a tool. That lantern, it was a keeper of time, a bearer of light, a guardian of rhythm and routine in a world ruled by the sky and soil. Even as the candle inside burned low, its glow stretched far, far enough to touch a heart, far enough to ease a child's dream, far enough to turn cold night into bearable, quiet, sometimes, as sleep overtook them. Someone would leave the lantern burning just a little longer, because something about that glow, made the night seem softer. Far away from the fields, and away from the cold breath of winter wind, there was a room that stayed warmer than most. It wasn't heated by fire. It wasn't warmed by boiling pots or glowing hearths. It was warmed by movement. Soft, steady, rhythmic movement. This was the weaving room, a place where threads became fabric, and silence was filled with the quiet clack of looms and the whisper of fingers working. In medieval times, weaving wasn't just a craft, it was a rhythm of life. And in the deep heart of winter, it became one of the few jobs that could be done indoors, surrounded by family. While snow layered the world in stillness outside, the loom stood tall in the corner of the cottage, built of solid wood, maybe beech, maybe ash. It was heavy and old, passed down from one generation to the next. It squeaked when it moved, like it was sighing, and sometimes it creaked as if it had a story of its own to tell. The weaver, often the mother or elder sister, would sit on a worn stool, feet wrapped in cloth to keep them warm. Her hands moved with practiced ease, guiding the shuttle back and forth, thread by thread, row by row. She built warmth from nothing but wool and patience. Children sat nearby, sometimes helping, sometimes dreaming. One child might wind yarn into balls, carefully keeping it from tangling. Another might brush the wool gently with thistles to soften it before it was spun. And a smaller one might simply sit and watch the threads dance over and under, again and again, till their eyes grew heavy. The weaving room was filled with small sounds, not loud, just comforting. The soft beat of the loom, the rustle of fabric, a kettle murmuring over coals, Outside, the wind howled like an old song, but inside, the rhythm never changed. The loom whispered secrets in every motion. Each piece of cloth made here had a future, a purpose. It might become a scarf to wrap around a child's neck on cold mornings, or a blanket to cover two sleeping bodies huddled together against the night. It might become a sleeve, or a bag, or a cloth to lay over bread. Every thread mattered. The wool itself came from the sheep they raised. Each spring, the sheep were sheared carefully, gently, and the wool was washed, combed, and spun. Spinning was another gentle rhythm, done by the fire in the evenings. The spinning wheel hummed like a lullaby, and the thread coiled into neat skeins. In the weaving room, the air smelled of lanolin, the oil from sheep's wool. It was earthy, warm, and familiar, and as the cloth grew, inch by inch, it was rolled carefully around a beam. There was a quiet satisfaction in seeing it come to life. They wove more in winter because there was more time. The fields rested under snow. The animals were fed and quiet. The roads were too frozen to travel, so they wove by morning light. Slipping through thick glass or thin horn windows, they wove by firelight and lantern glow. And as they worked, they sometimes sang softly old songs about forests, rivers, the sun's return, not to pass time, but to shape it, to fill it with something human, something tender. On some days, neighbors would come. The weaving room would grow warmer with laughter, with stories, with the clatter of wooden spindles and the brushing of wool. Women shared news and tales. Children listened with wide eyes. And still, the threads moved, over and under, like footsteps. In snow, the loom taught patience. It taught that slow work was good work, that beauty could be built one gentle act at a time, that a thread, though fragile on its own, could become strong when woven together with others. In this way, the weaving room wasn't just a workshop, it was a lesson in softness, in warmth, in the kind of strength that doesn't shout. Some nights, when all was quiet, the weaver would pause and press her hand to the cloth. Feel the softness, the warmth, the weight of it. She would smile, not for praise, not for pride, but because she knew this cloth would protect someone she loved from the cold. Outside, the frost clung to the trees. The stars burned above in silent brilliance. But in the weaving room, The warmth held fast, and the cloth grew longer, and the rhythm continued, and the night softened. Asterisk. Not all seasons can be seen. Some live only in hope. In medieval villages, blanketed with snow and shadow, spring didn't always arrive with blossoms or birdsong. Sometimes it first appeared only in thoughts, in the warm breath of a cow in a cold barn, in the creak of boots that no longer cracked the ice beneath them, or in a dream. On the coldest nights, when the fire had died down to a quiet red glow, and the air tasted like frozen bark, the peasants dreamed of spring. They didn't speak of it often. To name it too early was almost a kind of superstition, like calling a shy animal into the open too soon. But they felt it, in little things, a drop of melted ice at the edge of a roof, a chicken clucking a little more cheerfully, the way the wind sometimes whispered rather than roared. That was how they knew. Spring wasn't here, but it was thinking of coming, and that was enough. In cottages where smoke curled slowly from low chimneys, families clung to these signs like fragile treasures. Children were told, "Don't run barefoot just yet. The ground still bites." But they also heard, soon, soon, they would walk outside without layers, stacked like armor, soon. The sun would return with enough strength to stir the mud and tickle the grass. But for now, they waited. Waiting was a kind of ritual in the medieval winter. A quiet art, not impatient, not restless, just ... slow, trusting. You see. The people who survived those long nights weren't waiting with watches or calendars. They didn't have forecasts. They didn't mark their days with red circles or hopeful notes. They watched the sky. They listened to the ground. They noticed the animals. They remembered the year before, and the one before that. What day the frost finally broke. What week the geese flew overhead. What morning the earth finally gave back the sound of water running under the frozen brook. They carried these memories not in books, but in their bones. And those bones told them, just hold on. So they held on. Not just through fire and fur and food, but through laughter and songs and quiet, repetitive work. The kind that settled the heart. Because that's what winter survival was. A rhythm. Chop the wood. Feed the goats. Mend the shoe. Stir the pot. Spin the thread. Wrap the sleeping child in the thickest blanket. Listen to the snow tapping the window like a lullaby, and then, one day, someone would say it not loud, just enough to float into the stillness. I smelled the dirt this morning. A simple thing, but if you've lived in winter, real winter, you know, when frozen ground begins to thaw, it smells like life. Like the start of everything again. That's when they would smile, carefully, softly. Because spring wasn't a celebration, with trumpets and banners. Not for peasants. Not for those who lived close to the soil. It was a gentle shift, a kindness after hardship. The animals stirred more. The hens laid more eggs. A single green shoot might peek from the edge of the garden. The children would spot it first, squealing with delight. The adults would laugh not because they were surprised, but because joy is stronger when it's shared. They would begin to prepare differently, not just to survive, but to plant. The tools would be brought out of hiding, the seeds inspected, the earth, still cool and soft, like an old friend returning, would be turned with reverence. They had done it again, made it through the cold, through the endless nights, the empty pots, the silent fields, and in that survival there was no fanfare, just a quiet pride. A sense of being rooted, like the old trees outside that held their ground, even as the sky froze and cracked. So now, as you drift further into sleep, imagine it, the last night of winter, the fire burning just enough to glow, the wind no longer sharp, the floor no longer bitter underfoot, and a whisper outside. Not of snowflakes, but of soft, early rain. You are wrapped in wool, soft and warm. The blanket smells of smoke and sheep and the long patience of winter. Your belly is full. Your hands are still. Your breath moves slowly in and out. And somewhere beyond the dark window, a crocus stretches toward the pale sun. Spring is almost here, but for now, the world is quiet. You are safe, you are still, and all is well. The end. Thank you for joining DreamNest Stories. If you enjoyed this calming journey through medieval nights, please gently tap that like button and consider subscribing for more peaceful stories.